All right, anyway, let's get started. We were in chapter 5. We're in the middle of chapter 5. We're in 1 Kings chapter 5. And we're going to start at verse 15. And what we've seen until now was we had examples of Solomon's wisdom. We were seeing how his rule is extended, how he is wealthy, and all this stuff has happened. And we saw that it was particularly the statement that we saw in chapter. Why can't I find it? I thought it was chapter 5. Yeah, chapter 5, verse 5. Right. All the days of Solomon, Judah and Israel from Dan to Beersheba dwelt in safety, everyone under his own vine and under his own fig tree. And we talked about how that was particularly a statement that reflected calm, quiet, prosperity, peace, etc. Okay, so now, and in verse 14, of course, we learned about how he was so smart, Solomon, that people just came from all over to study or learn from his wisdom. So now we'll start with verse 15. King Hiram of Tyre sent his officials to Solomon when he heard that he had been anointed king in place of his father, for Hiram had always been a friend of David. So let's first go back to where we saw this friendship, okay? So go back to 2 Samuel chapter 4, verse 11. Chapter 4, now verse 11. I don't think that's it. No, it's not chapter 4. No, I wrote it wrong.
It's 5 verse 11, I think.
It's what?
5 verse 11, maybe.
Let's see. Yes, you're right. Thank you. Yes, 5 verse 11. We see here that after we see that David is growing stronger, and we have a similar situation where Hiram, here it's a little differently, because instead of Solomon turning to Hiram, Hiram turns to David, and it says, King Hiram of Tyre sent envoys to David with cedar logs, carpenters and stonemasons, and they built a palace for David. Thus David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and had exalted his kingship for the sake of his people Israel. And we learn how we see here, and I mean, this was the beginning, but we see that this was Hiram himself reaching out to David, being so impressed with what he's seeing and hearing about him. Here, we see it's similar in the sense that Hiram also initiates it. He sends officials to Solomon when he heard been his anointed. So basically he's saying, I had wonderful relationship with David. As we saw, he on his own volition sent cedars of Lebanon to David so that he could build a palace. And excuse me. And here we see that he hears that Solomon is going to become king, or has become king in place of his father. And he, on the basis of that friendship, now he sent some kind of officials. But what happens next in verse 16? Solomon sent this message to Hiram. You know that my father David could not build a house for the name of the Lord his God because of the enemies that encompassed him, until the Lord had placed them under the soles of his feet. Now, this is very interesting, because we discussed this earlier when David is told by Nathan that he cannot build. David wants, as soon as he feels that he's defeated his enemies, it ends up being more of a pause in the war than an actual end of his wars. But he felt that this was the right time, and he turns to Nathan. He says, I want to build the temple. And Nathan thinks it's a great idea, but then God sends a prophecy through Nathan to David saying, no, you're not the one to build the temple. It will be your son. But in the book of Samuel, we don't have the reason, okay? And we discussed this then, and we know that there are like, for example, Book of Chronicles does have a reason. Here, Solomon has a reason. He says, because the enemies were still there. He was still, here it says enemies, but the Hebrew is actually the war, because the war still surrounded him. And in the Book of Chronicles, it's more like because his hands he had blood on his hands from all the wars. But it's the same answer really, which Solomon has. And you can ask yourself, well, how did Solomon know? And that is something we also learn in Chronicles, because in Chronicles we have what we don't have in the Samuel Kings books. In Chronicles, it says that David actually called Solomon and instructed Solomon before his death on how to build the temple, and that David himself actually began preparing some of the vessels, the gold and the silver, and that we learn in Chronicles. Here, that is hinted in a few places, but we don't have it actually played out as this whole handing the instruction over and David explaining to Solomon that he was not allowed to build the temple because of the wars. So here we know it actually happened, but only because this is what Solomon is now saying to Hiram. But now the Lord my God has given me respite all round. There is no adversary and no mischance. Now, it's very interesting, this statement here in verse 18, he's using this giving me respite I'm not sure if it's the same words in Hebrew. That would be interesting to see, but it's, excuse me, if you go back to 2 Samuel and chapter 7, verse 1, and this is right before, it's right at the point at which David expresses his desire to build the temple. How does that chapter begin? When the king was settled in his palace, and the Lord had granted him, see, different English, same Hebrew, okay? And the Lord had granted him safety from all the enemies around him, okay? Here, the same words in Hebrew are translated as giving him respite, okay? So in Hebrew, it's exactly the same words. It's heniach. It's using the word heniach, which means to let it rest or let it be, or, it is, we have the English translation is correct in both places, except you miss the fact that it's the exact same word. And we have this word in a few different places. We discussed it a bit then, but it's very interesting because what we saw in chapter 7 in 2 Samuel was because as a result of this pause in the wars, David thought that the wars are over and it's the right time to build the temple. And of course, the wars weren't over. We continued studying in 2 Samuel. He goes on, there are wars, there's problems, there's issues. David had a complicated life. But here, Solomon now is echoing the same idea. God has given him respite, or has given him rest from all the enemies. But now it is indeed the right time. First of all, we know that David already told Solomon, you're the one who built the temple. But we also learned in the previous chapter how Solomon now has a stable empire. He is at peace with the neighbors and prosperity within. So it really is the right time to build the temple. And he goes on in verse 19, and so he's still speaking to Hiram, or he's sending this message to Hiram. And so I propose to build a house for the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord promised my father David, saying, your son whom I will set on your throne in your place shall build the house for my name. Please then give orders for cedars to be cut for me in the Lebanon. My servants will work with yours, and I will pay you any wages you may ask for your servants. For as you know, there's none among us who knows how to cut timber like the Sidonians, Sidon, the people from Sidon. So here, unlike what happened between Hiram and David, where Hiram is the one who offers and sends the cedars to David without being asked. And in fact, when David sees this amazing initiative, on the part of Hiram, he realizes God is with him. Here, Solomon actually turns to Hiram, and he doesn't ask it for free. He asks to buy these timbers, and he puts forward a proposal, which is really a business proposal. And he says, he will send, he says, I will pay, he says, my servants will work with yours. So he's going to send his men, but they will be helping the people from Sidon because, as he says, nobody understands how to cut timber like the people from Sidon. Of course, even today, if you look at the flag of Lebanon, the flag of Lebanon has a picture of a cedar tree. Since biblical times, Lebanon has been famous for its cedars, and therefore the people of Sidon are the ones who are the greatest experts in cutting down the cedars and creating the lumber or whatever it is you need in order to use it for building. So that's his proposal. And I think it's very interesting because it's not a pure business proposal. On the one hand, he is offering to pay. He's not asking for favors or for gifts. But on the other hand, he is definitely building on the fact on two things that are let's say, may pull at his emotional interest. Hiram's, one is the relationship between David and Hiram, and he's talking about that. My father David wanted to build this house and he was not allowed to, but now I am going to do it. So it's as if in participating in this, in a way, he's helping, Hiram would be helping, maybe making his dear friend David, fulfill his dream by his son. But the second thing, he's giving him the opportunity, we're talking here, build a house for the name of the Lord my God, so that Solomon is also putting into the content of this message. It's not just a palace. It's not just a pretty place. This is something to honor God. And so he's giving him an opportunity to take place in a spiritual endeavor as well, a spiritual blessing. And I think both of these things, of course, speak to Hiram in a very special way. And so he responds, when Hiram heard Solomon's message, he was overjoyed. Praise be the Lord this day, he said, for granting David a wise son to govern his great people. So I think, first of all, he immediately does praise be the Lord. And I think this praise be the Lord is not just thanking God for Solomon, but I think he's echoing the fact that, yes, I want to be part of this temple for the Lord. Now, is he pagan? I'm sure he is. But in the ancient world, pagans could believe in a lot of gods. So they would more likely have seen the God of Israel to be the God of Israel, but the God of Sidon, is somebody else. So there would have been tremendous respect, which from Hiram to the God of Israel. He may even, for all I know, have seen the God of Israel as something, maybe a bit of a superpower. I'm not sure, but definitely he clearly honors and respects the God of Israel, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't believe in his pagan gods. Okay, but that's okay. That's okay. This is a good man with the ability to recognize God's blessings and the wise people that God has placed on the throne of Israel. So Hiram sent word to Solomon, have your message. I will supply all the cedar and cypress logs you require. My servants will bring them down to the sea from the Lebanon, and at the sea I will make them into floats and deliver them to any place that you designate to me. There I shall break them up for you to carry away. You in turn will supply the food I require for my household. So he goes back and he says, okay, you said you'll pay for them. This is what I'm going to do. This is what you're going to do. And it's very interesting because if you think of it geographically, Lebanon, there's the mountains of Lebanon, and then there's the coast. And Tyre, which is, where he's from, the king of Tyre's on the coast. So basically they're going further inland, they're cutting the trees down up in the mountains, they're bringing them down to the coast, making rafts out of them, sailing down the coast to the Mediterranean Sea until they get to a port in Israel, possibly Jaffa, which is a natural port. And from there, he's already an expert. He's been cutting down and shipping wood. Probably he's a major wood exporter, of the time. So he knows how to transport this and how to cut them. And then he'll say, once I'll have them ready for you when they dock in Jaffa or wherever they dock, it'll be my people will put them together in such a way they'll be easy for you to transport because of course they have to get to Jerusalem. So Hiram kept Solomon provided with all the cedar and cypress wood he required, and Solomon delivered to Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat as provisions for his household and 20 cores of beaten oil. Such was Solomon's annual payment to Hiram. Okay, so this is, he said, you have to give us the food that we need for us, for our people, for our men, whatever. And he does that. And, but it says here, and this I found very interesting, he says it was his annual payment to Hiram. And the question, of course, is what does this mean, annual payment? And to me, it struck a chord because, we know about annual payments. Okay, we know, for example, again, if we're going to go back to 2 Solomon, in chapter 8, for example, in chapter 8, we have a list of wars that David is fighting. Okay, and in each case, when he defeats the people, what happens? They pay him. They give him silver. They give him gold. And this becomes an ongoing thing. So, for example, if you look at 2 Samuel chapter 8, verse 14, he stationed garrisons in Edom. He stationed garrisons in all of Edom, and all the Edomites became vassals of David. Okay, now in English, the word is servants, not necessarily vassals. But what this means is that they are paying regular homage and taxes, if you will, or it's a financial arrangement that David, in building his the empire, or the nation, the country that he hands over to Solomon, is a country at peace with its neighbors, that has reached its fullest borders in the land of Israel, but in addition has subdued the various nations surrounding Israel, not by conquering them, not by settling them, but by instituting a system by where these countries pay taxes or send gold and silver or whatever, some kind of an homage to David. And that kind of keeps them understanding that they cannot be starting wars. I mean, these are all countries that had at one point or another fought against Israel, and he creates a situation that he is the boss and they are paying him homage. So when you have here a statement that Solomon is paying a regular payment to Hiram, king of Tyre, the first thing that came to my mind is like, what is this every year thing? Okay. And so I looked it up, and it turns out all the commentaries that I saw, every single one, interpret this as being only an annual payment for the length of time that he was receiving wood to build the temple. And we'll learn later that the process of building the temple took years, okay? So that it's only for that amount of time. And I'm sure that that is the case, but I have to question, why is it, okay, that it's written in such a way that it sounds dangerous, okay? And I think we talked about this in the past. Solomon is like amazing now. He's at his height. Everything is great. But similar happened with David. At some point, things begin to slip. And I think we're also going to see certain things slipping, that the hints are given here. This idea of a taxation of the nation in order to pay for the temple, and this annual tax, the annual money that he's paying to Hiram. There are certain hints that are being set here that we're going to see later on playing out, that this may refer to. I'm not sure, but I'm just kind of planting that in your heads, and then we'll follow it up later on to see if any of this actually turns into something that's actually negative. But the way it's here, I think there's just a slight hint of it, because the chapter as a whole is extremely positive. And we'll see in the very next verse 26, the Lord had given Solomon wisdom as he had promised him. There was friendship between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a treaty. So this verse really sets forth a very positive perception of the relationship that Solomon has now created with Hiram. There is a treaty, but it's seen as something very positive, okay? King Solomon imposed forced labor on all Israel. Now, I want to explain this. In Hebrew, the word here is mas, and mas in Hebrew today we understand as tax. In fact, that is the modern Hebrew word for tax, income tax, sales tax, all that is mas. And when in modern times, when we talk about taxation, we talk about money, okay? Everybody has to give a certain percentage of their income to the coffers of the country. Here, though, the most common taxation, and usually here in the Bible, sometimes it actually uses the word mas oved, which means a labor tax. But most often, even when it doesn't say labor tax, it just says tax, the reference is for labor. What does that mean? It's kind of like reserve duty, okay? Except instead of being called up to the army, you're called up to put in your time doing work for the king. And so here we had 30,000 men, okay? What is he doing with the 30,000 men? The next verse will tell us. He sent them to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 a month. They would spend 1 month in the Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of the forced labor. In other words, what happens? Instead of having to pay a third of your income to the coffers of the king, you gave a third of your time to the king. And that's, remember he had said to Hiram, I'm going to send my men to work with your men to cut down the cedars. So this probably was a major undertaking to cut down and ship these cedars and for the temple. And so this is what we're seeing now. This was forced on the people. You had no choice. You got your draft notice and you reported for duty. You went for a month away from home, and then you could come home and spend 2 months tending your fields, doing whatever, and then you had to go again. So, once every 3 months, you had to be away from home in Lebanon. That's quite a burden. And that is something that, of course, here is presented as a very positive thing. This was how Solomon is building the temple. But on the other hand, we will see later on, much later on, after Solomon's death, when Rehoboam becomes king, what is one of the things that really is a reason that Jeroboam rebels and takes 10 tribes away from Rehoboam is this issue of the taxes, okay? And this went on for years. And so there is this idea that on the one hand, this made sense, this is for the temple, and yet like a few of these other hints we have, is this laying the groundwork for problems that will show up later on in Solomon's reign. Solomon also had, I'm on verse 29, Solomon also had 70,000 porters and 80,000 warriors in the hills. Okay, so he had people to carry things, the various things they need, and the quarriers, because he also needed stone. Okay, and how do you get stone in Israel? You quarry it. We're full of limestone here. You saw the stone all over is Jerusalem stone, which is the stone that you see as the facades on all the buildings in Jerusalem, is the very same stone that's in the Temple Mount. That's the retaining wall. Of course, that's not from Solomon's temple. That's later on. It's the second temple. But it was the same, limestone is limestone is limestone. That is the stone we have here. And this is what he quarried. Apart from Solomon's 3,300 officials who were in charge of the work and supervised the gangs doing the work. So we have this massive undertaking in employees, okay, in personnel that is being co-opted for this big project. The king ordered huge blocks of choice stone to be quarried so that the foundations of the house might be laid with hewn stones. Solomon's masons, Hiram's masons, and the men of Geval shaped them. Thus the timber and the stones for building the house were made ready. So here we learn that not only does Hiram's people help out with the cedars, but they also help out with the quarrying, and the quarrying is done here, not in Lebanon. So in other words, there's real economic relationship going on, and Hiram becomes a real partner in the building of the temple. Let's just start chapter 6. In the 480th year, after the Israelites left the land of Egypt, in the month of Ziv, that is the second month in the 4th year of his reign over Israel, Solomon began to build the house of the Lord. So 480 years after the exodus from Egypt means 440 years since the entrance of the people into the land of Israel. And this, of course, makes a lot of sense because we know that the period of the judges, okay, is close to 400 years. And David's reign was 40 years. So the fact that it's 440 years makes a lot of sense. Okay. Let's see. The house which King Solomon built for the Lord was 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. The portico in front of the great hall of the house was 20 cubits long, and along the width of the house, 10 cubits deep, and et cetera, et cetera. Now I'm going to tell you something. We're now chapter 6, chapter 7, and chapter 6 and chapter 7 are filled with details as to the temple, what the size was, what it was made of, what the various things were. Okay. Now it's all translated into English, but I can tell you that translating this is very difficult because a lot of the words are weird words in Hebrew and and unusual words, not words that you find in other places. So, you know, it isn't the easiest thing to translate. So when the translators translated, they made decisions, okay, which is fine. But I am not going to go through these chapters word for word because I don't think it's that important. I mean, you know, you're certainly welcome to read it, but what I want to do is just focus on certain key points that I want to stress. And so that's what we're going to do. You know what, you know what, I'm going to stop here because, you know, I'm going to start next week with this thing. I'm going to go through certain select verses in these chapters that have special meaning, I think, and it tells us something, you know, something about the idea of the temple, or, you know, gives us extra meaning, extra significance, but we're going to skip the stuff that talks about the building materials and what it looked like and what it doesn't look like. However, I am also going to spend a little bit of time with a basic overview on the difference between Solomon's temple and the tabernacle as presented in the book of Exodus, and what that means, because I think that is an important question. The only place that we have details of a decree, of an order from God, what the tabernacle or what the temple is supposed to look like, is the order for the tabernacle. Now it's clear that the tabernacle is a permanent building, is going to not be made of skins and fabrics, but will be built of stone. Okay, but the question is, number one, the size. This is a different size. Where did that come from? But much more significantly to me, because I think that it makes a tremendous amount of sense to just build the size that makes sense for a permanent temple. People are going to be coming from all over. All of that makes sense. The basic structure remains the same. There's an outer courtyard, and then within 2 chambers, the Holy of Holies and the Holy. All that remains. However, the vessels, I mean, we're going to see the cherubites, completely different. The menorah, completely different. And that's the kind of thing that I want to we'll touch on that a little bit to see what are the differences and what some of the commentaries say as to the significance of these differences. So we're going to stop here. As I said, next week, we will start with a few significant verses in these chapters, and then we're going to go on to a comparison, which we may not get to next week. I don't know exactly. And we'll then do a comparison of the temple with the tabernacle. Okay, any questions or comments?
I did have one comment. It's me again.
Pardon?
It is me again. No, it's just your comment that was interesting about David in 2 Samuel 7 about him having rest. And that's why he wanted to build a temple, and that we get commentary on this and him in Chronicles. I found it and then I lost it, but I know it's 1 Chronicles 21 somewhere. We get a comment also from God, don't we, to David saying, I'm not going to let you to build the temple because there was so much bloodshed in your reign.
Right. That's definitely,
It's
right.
one.
That's what I was referring to. That's where you get the answer. In other words, that's the place where you get the answers to why, because in the book of Solomon, it doesn't say why. God never says, I'm not going to let you build temple because. He just visits him as a thing. So we only see that in Chronicles, and we see it, it's here, I found it. I think it's here.
It's 1 Chronicles 21, I think.
I see 22. Let me just
22, okay.
yeah, here it is. It's in Chronicles, 1 Chronicles 22, verse 7.
7.
David said to Solomon, see, again, we don't have this whole story before in the book of Samuel or Kings. We don't have this David giving the instruction to Solomon about the temple. We have it only in Chronicles. And it says here, David said to Solomon, my son, I wanted to build a house for the name of the Lord my God, but the word of the Lord came to me saying, you have shed much blood and fought great battles. You shall not build a house for my name, for you have shed much blood on the earth in my sight. But you will have a son who will be a man at rest, okay? For I give him rest from all his enemies on all sides. And here, for the first time, you have a man at rest. In Hebrew, it's much easier to explain. It says menucha, as opposed to yaniach. Yaniach is that God will lay to rest. Menucha is a state, a perpetual state of rest. And this is what I think is part of the difference. It wasn't just that he had blood on his hands, but that he never did stop his battles. He had ceasefires. And I think this came to me as we've been talking about Gaza and all, you know, the negotiations have been going on now for all this time between Israel and Hamas. They want a total cessation of the war. Israel says only a ceasefire. And it's this difference. In other words, David had a number of ceasefires where he had periods of time where he had no battles. But it was only Solomon that is described here in Chronicles as a man at rest, okay? Because he really finished the war, okay? Or David, I think, finished the war and handed it to Solomon. He inherited a situation of no war. And of course, that's, I think, very much expressed by each man under his fig tree and under his and his vineyard. So, you know, so that's it. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so thank you very much. We will see you next week.